in 2024, any place that isn't being inclusive or accessible, I think we need to start using the word discrimination. Like, it might be discrimination of omission, but a lot of times it's more than that, like they know that they're inaccessible. I've talked to them about it. They're just not doing anything about it. So they're not the victims at this point of, oh, it's expensive. Because 34 years in, you can creatively fundraise. You can save your tips. Like, say, not your tips, but like, you can have people say, do you want to donate $1 to the Access Fund? There's like lots of creative ways in 34 years that you can be making yourself more accessible.
Oh my goodness, you are such an inspiration. Wow, you really are. You're so strong. Can I pet your service dog? Ugh. 1, 2, 3, let's go! We are artists, parents, teachers, good guys, bad guys, students, leaders. I'm not your inspiration, yeah, I'm fully who I am. Got my own expectations that don't fit into your plans. I'm not your sad story, so I wrote it in this song. Everything you know about disability is wrong. Everything you know. Yeah, everything you know about disability is wrong.
We're back with another season of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong, and we are so excited for another season full of authentic conversations from within the disability community.
We have some incredible guests lined up for the season, including today. So without further ado, let's get started.
In 2016, you won NPR's Tiny Desk concert and captivated audiences around the world with your haunting original songs and traditional fiddle tunes. You've opened for bands such as Wilco, the Decemberists, Low, and the industrial rock supergroup Pigface. You composed music for Macbeth on Broadway. I'm a theater kid, so I'm going to knock on some wood after saying that. And that was directed by Sam Gold and starring Daniel Craig and Ruth Negga.
And outside of playing music and composing, you're a disability advocate and passionate about disability culture, and you also founded the Recording Artists and Music Professionals with Disabilities, also known as Rant, and with our former guest, Lachi, from last season.
Welcome to the show, Gaelynn Lea. We are so excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm Gaelynn Lea. I am a short white woman in an electric wheelchair with shorter limbs. I'm wearing a multicolored gold dress and some fake pearl bracelets and pink flower clip. And I got my dark hair down and I'm sitting in my kitchen. And I'm very, very happy to be talking with you both today.
Thanks for kicking off our audio descriptions. This is Lily speaking. I am a white-presenting young woman with brown hair and green eyes, and I'm wearing my favorite shirt, which is a black button-up with a little barbed wire decal and white fringe. Got a little bit of
awesome.
Kenergy going on today.
And I'm Erin. I'm white-presenting. I have reddish hair, blue eyes, and I'm wearing a gray sweater. It's very, very comfortable.
Let's get into the questions.
Yay.
So we named this podcast Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong. And we'd like to ask all our guests, what do people get wrong about you and your disability?
Well, I think the biggest thing, there's a couple things, but the biggest thing I think is just that assuming that my childhood was really hard because of my disability. Ironically, I would say that more of the barriers that face disabled people didn't start impacting me until I was an adult and kind of got in the real world and realized there was like job discrimination and inaccessible environments and just not a lot of support at college and all the things that ended up being kind of a bigger deal. And so I grew up the only disabled kid in my family. There's 4 siblings total, and my parents are just really awesome. And I had a really, really supportive community too. There was a occupational therapist who I told her I wanted to be a ballet dancer, and she just like started a ballet class for kids with disabilities. And this is in like the late 80s, so way before mean, it's not that uncommon now, but it was really uncommon at the time. And so I just had a really good childhood. We were definitely lower income, and so it wasn't like a privileged childhood in that regard, but it was definitely a very nurturing one. So that's probably the first thing is like people wonder, did you struggle a lot with disability growing up? And obviously, it's something you think about, like, oh, I wish I could walk. Sometimes it would come to mind, but the most part, like the vast majority, I just had a really fun childhood and have a lot of positive memories. And then the other thing is just the idea that, disability is inherently negative. I mean, I think that's sort of probably the whole point of this podcast is to kind of help people to think about disability as like a form of diversity that is the way that you exist in the world, and there's nothing inherently good or bad about the way that you're born. It's about how society responds to you, and then also what you do with the situation that you're in, and that there's a lot of beautiful things that can be done in the life of a disabled person, and that we enrich our society and inherently have worth, and all these things that I think underneath the surface in our culture, we haven't quite gotten to that point where people think of disability as just a form of diversity rather than something that's like a big liability or something negative. So those are the two main things, I think. On the top of my head, I'm sure there's more.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that like that first point is like the foundation of what makes the second point of the assuming that we had terrible childhoods, and that, having a non-apparent disability, it's like when I'll tell someone for the first time, you get the worst responses that like, oh, I'm sorry. And I'm like, well, I'm not.
Exactly.
But I think that, it does come from that, like assuming a really negative childhood. I know, Erin, you've talked about this in past episodes.
Yeah, like I'm not gonna lie and say it was perfect. So I did go through like some bad shit with my health, especially. But like outside of that, my childhood was very like basic. I had friends. I went to school. I think the big thing was that I was mainstreamed throughout my schooling, and I was like one of the only visibly disabled people in high school, but I still have like tons of friends. I dated guys at 12 years old,
Whoa.
That's not how that is. Like, it's not real.
When you're 12.
But it feels
but, like,
so real when you're 12.
It does. It really does. But yeah, so I think like having disability mainstreamed, I think really impacts, how we're viewed in society, and especially how we view ourselves too.
Absolutely. And what you're saying about the assuming disability as a negative thing, I think that I saw something on Twitter the other day, which was responding to the usual like super ableist thing where people are like, it's not a disability, it's special ability or extra ability or something. And it's like the person who responded to it said, disability is a net neutral term. Like it's and I hadn't heard that phrasing of it before, and I really liked that because I've heard that in like the fat liberation movement being used, that like fat is a net neutral term, and I really like that. Like exactly what you said, it's just another form of diversity, so there's no need to be like, oh, you're not disabled, you're great. It's like, no, I am, and great.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think to your point, like it's important to remember that not everyone with disabilities does have a great childhood. There's a lot of people, I mean, I like anyone, like any form of diversity. There's people who grew up in supportive homes, who have a wide network of community around them and friends and all this stuff. And then there's people that don't. And so, yeah, it is like actually like diversity in the same way that some people's experience with disability is more negative. And I don't want to negate, like, there are parts of my disability story that are less pleasant, I would say, than others, right? And so it's just like, I mean, it's so just like any other form of diversity that I can't say it more times. Like, there are experiences that every cultural background, every minority in America have that are like both good and bad, and parts of it that they really embrace and parts of it that were harder, and like we're still equally valuable regardless of all of those things. And that's where I just really want people to like try to wrap their minds around this idea of diversity, because diversity doesn't imply that because of a certain background everything was great or everything was terrible. It's just like you experienced life from this lens, and that's really what it means, you know?
Yeah, I think if we were to, take our already very long podcast title and make it even more like on the spot, it would be that like everything you know about disability is assumptions. Actually, like so much assumption, and like that, thinking that you understand this whole group because of a single experience that you happen to, like, you knew the one disabled kid in your class growing up, so you think you understand disability. And it's like that. I think that you hit on a great point of that, like exactly what you said. How many times can we say, like, it's just like any other form of diversity. There's really, really amazing, wonderful disabled people. There's also like wickedly evil disabled people. And there's funny disabled people and not funny and happy and sad. Like we have, the full human experience.
Yep, exactly. Well, and that's the thing is, I've been thinking a lot about this lately, just because, even the disability community, I think, can fall into this trap sometimes when we talk about non-disabled people, like kind of sarcastically or whatever, like, because we have a lot of, I too also have been wounded in ways by non-disabled people's assumptions or whatever. So you tend to kind of like, I don't know if it's a defense mechanism or it's easier or just like we do it because we're humans, but like we tend to categorize people. And I really want us to like watch not just the disability community. Obviously, this is for everyone. This is very universal. Like, I think it's really important to name our experiences specifically that like hurt us and like be able to talk about them. But then it's really, really try to avoid overgeneralizing. Like that means all non-disabled people are like this, or that means all, women are like that. Like anytime we start getting into generalizing, we are automatically like doing a disservice to that group of people because we're not acknowledging their full humanity. Like each of us we each bring something to the table and we each have our own unique histories. I think we should definitely amplify those, and especially those who have been underrepresented, in the disability community, like people of color and queer people. And I think it's really, really important to tell their stories and to listen to their stories and learn something from them. But that being said, none of us need to get down to the road where we're generalizing other groups that aren't exactly like us, because we know on the receiving end that generalizing is harmful, so I don't want to do it to another group. So I try, even though it's hard, because I don't ever walk into a situation, but like when I come into a situation where I'm nervous that something, that my disability is going to be perceived in a certain way, or that I'm going to run into a barrier, if I go into it with this mindset instead of really trying to stay open, I don't know. Does that make sense? I just think the universality of disability, what we've learned really applies to like any other group, and we can all be learning from each other. If that makes any sense. I feel like that was a little bit in the weeds. Hopefully.
No, I think that makes complete sense, and also is a great like reminder of that, like the best way to like influence others is to like lead with your own. And when you think about that on a community level, is like, yeah, if we want non-disabled people to come in judgment free and meet us all as the human we are, we have to
do the same
start.
To them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, and like we all fail at this in some way at some point, like I have for sure. But yeah, that idea of like, if we are going to have people meet us where we are, we really have to try to give the same to them. And that's what would make a much more awesome society, just generally, I think, if we could try to meet each other where we're at. And still have boundaries, obviously. Like, you need to be able to say, like, this isn't okay, and, like, feel empowered to do that. But but meeting people without assumptions that you for sure aren't going to be seen as full. Trying to see each other in that way is important to me, anyways. The older I get, I'm 40 now, so I'm not really old, but I'm starting to look back and be like, what would make for like the next generation? Like, what can we be thinking about? Like the next step. Think how much we came, like how far things have come since like 50 years ago. Like our parents' generation. I mean, being disabled back then would have been so different. Especially, I mean, you know, as an electric wheelchair user, just like such a different realm. And so I think we've made a lot of progress, and then we have a lot of progress to go still with like really making it equitable and like, and then what's the next step of like making it equitable, but also like compassionate to all people, because that is really what we want, right? Is that everyone is accepted for who they are. So like, how do we actually make that work in our movement so that people see it as an example?
I love that. And I think that, you know, I think 40 is obviously very young, but at the same time, like, I think that I'm 26, and I think about like myself as like a 13-year-old or who's 13 now. And like, I'm so excited for the groups of kids like being born now that are going to have such a wonderful group of like disabled elders, like leading the way, like, and talking and like, you know, having podcasts like this that like just exist aren't like a exciting new thing. Like in the point you brought up about electric wheelchairs, like technology wise, we're like becoming, it only makes sense that the world should become more inclusive and accepting as we have like better technology and can make the world more accessible. Like, I think that's a really great point to start with, and really hammers home the idea of everything you know about disability is wrong. Like, as a podcast, it's our thesis to be like, let's make the world a better, more accepting place. And I love that, starting from with us. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
Well, moving on from a little bit of just getting to know you, obviously you have such a cool career. So I just want to talk about your life a little bit. Erin, do you want to take us away with part 2 of the interview?
Yeah, sure. So your career really took off after the NPR Tiny Desk concert. So can you tell us a bit about that, and what was it like? How was your experience? And how has that impacted your work and the music industry?
Yeah. Well, you know, I was a musician, like hobby musician before that. I started violin in elementary school, in 5th grade, I guess, middle school. Played all the way through high school, and then knew I didn't want to keep doing classical forever, so I switched to fiddle, and I started joining bands, and I was really active, like playing like a lot of shows every month, but they were all local. And then I was also teaching fiddle lessons. And what was fun is I was teaching my students to play the like typical way, up on their shoulder, but I play very differently. I play like a cello, but it worked. And I had like, they were all beginner, intermediate students of all different ages. And I was in like a really good place. Like I was super duper, like I had just gotten married a couple of years back, and we had a house, so we were doing great. And then I entered the Tiny Desk contest. And because 3 people told me about it, it's not really my thing generally, or it wasn't my thing to be entering contests a lot, just because I was pretty busy already. I was already doing a bunch of stuff. And then, but when you hear about something 3 times, or like, seems like a universal, a sign from the universe that I should probably actually enter. So I entered the contest, and when I won a month later, like I hadn't heard anything in between. So I had no idea that was coming until the day they called me. When I won, I knew for sure that life was going to change a lot, but I didn't know how much. Like, and it's been great. It's just it was such a left turn. Like it was such a big game changer. And so I started getting requests to play all over the country and to do some speaking. I had just started speaking the year before. I had a really bad run-in with a county worker after I got married. I submitted all the paperwork to stay on a program for Medicaid for working people, employed people with, you know, who can stay on Medicaid, but she didn't like understand the program or something, and said I wasn't eligible for anything. I had just done like a ton of paperwork to get certified disabled and do all the stuff that you have to do to keep healthcare when you're employed. And she's like, well, you're not eligible for anything. And I was like, well, what do you suggest I do? And she said, I'd suggest you get a divorce. Like, we had just gotten married 3 weeks earlier, and I lost it. I like started yelling and swearing, which is not my typical MO, but I was so upset, like I couldn't express. So anyways, after that experience, so I'm yelling at her, and she got nervous, and I think she started reading the fine print, and she's like, oh wait, you do qualify for healthcare. But if I had hung up the phone and gotten a divorce, like how terrible would that have been? And I bet people have done that. You know, that's what I kind of started thinking, wow, people really need to learn more about disability. Like, this lady's supposed to be working with disabled people, and this is horrible. So I started doing public speaking after that incident, because I was like, I need to get, like, something has to change. And I guess I'll have to tell them about it, because obviously they're not getting it in school. You know, I actually had a friend in social work master's program, and she was saying, yeah, we only covered disability for like 1 day in our whole program. So that was pretty eye-opening to me. So I started speaking, and so when I won the Tiny Desk, I was already kind of doing public speaking, and they really dovetailed together really well. So my husband and I talked about it a lot and decided that we would try to tour, and we would kind of do a mix of public speaking and performance. It was mostly performance, but the public speaking kind of helped keep us afloat, because, by the way, an independent musician does not make a lot of gigs in the beginning of their career. So that's how we made it work. And we sold our house and got a van and like got a booking agent. And I was on the road like 9 months of the year for right up until COVID. Like, we were on our way to a bunch of shows when COVID happened. So it was such a big turn. It was really just so fun to be able to have this unexpected gift, kind of is what it felt like, of just being able to try touring. I mean, like, I don't think I would have done it otherwise, to be honest. Not at that level of like full time, just on the road all the time. And we had so many great memories. Like, even when COVID happened, that first full year, it was just like, okay, this is weird and not good. Obviously, there was a lot of terrible things, but I remember just feeling so lucky that we had been able to do like so much traveling in the last 4 years before that it was just it was a really cool time. Hope to do that again someday. We haven't gotten back on full time on the road yet, but it was a really great experience.
I love that you started all of that with the 3 people telling you, and the like universe called and you answered. Like, that's just
it's really how it felt though. Like, it was, I remember being like, wow, 3 people, that's weird. It was kind of like spooky almost, where I'm like, okay, I guess I'll enter. And my friend filmed it for me in my office because we couldn't find a videographer, and like, it's on my phone. It's the worst video in the world that I submitted because I had no good tech. And yeah, it did feel really meant to be. Like, I do kind of believe in that, that, you know, if you're there and you say yes to the things that are in front of you that feel okay, you know, like, don't say yes to stuff that feels horrible, obviously, but that you just don't have to know where the road is going to lead. You should just take it. That's how I've always tried to operate.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that you know, you were in a really great place before this happened. So I think sometimes as like a creative, there's kind of the feeling of like waiting for your big opportunity, and like, that's when I'll be happy. And I think that it's really important to like build your happiness, because usually it's actually like, once you've created the life you need, that the life you want kind of starts to begin, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is not related to disability, but I think it's an important like life lesson is that I was playing in Duluth with a person named Alan Sparhawk. He is a guitarist. He was in the band Low until his wife unfortunately passed away last year, but maybe even a year and a half ago now, because time goes very fast. But he had been playing, touring all over, you know, the country. They were pretty well known in the indie, like, lo-fi music scene. And I was playing in a side project with him from 2011 until, you know, short, like, after the Tiny Desk, we still played once in a while together, although we never toured together officially. But like, he, I got to see him in a much different stage in his career. And it's not like it was bad. He appreciated it. He loved it. But there's a whole new set of problems that comes the bigger you get as an artist. Like, it's not, the grass is always greener, is all I'm trying to say. And I remember learning just by watching him that there's really no point in wishing for your career to be somewhere that it's not, because A, you're not even enjoying what's in front of you, and there's no guarantee you're going to get the thing that you want. And once you get it, it's like anything, like there's goods and there's bads, and like there's no reason to wish away the present moment. And so I have always really tried with my music career, especially, but now writing this book and everything, like you can have dreams of, I have like dreams of like, wouldn't it be cool if the book did really well, and like that somehow allows us to like buy a house or something, you know what I mean? But if you get too tied to that, like it ruins the present, which isn't, like, it's just kind of, none of us are guaranteed anything beyond today. So like, what's the point of tying your happiness to something that's not in front of you? So career-wise, that's always been a goal. And when I start not doing that, when I start like envying other people's careers or wondering why I'm not farther, or is my disability keeping me at a certain level because of the media, the way the media works, I know that then I'm kind of like focusing on the wrong things. That's like a red flag to me, to like step back and be like, what is going on here? That I'm starting to get lose focus of making art and just like being grateful that that's what I do for a living, which is cool in its own way, even if it doesn't get like widely recognized or as widely as I dreamed or whatever. I mean, so rant, the end.
An important rant that I hope that like listeners, I hope you took that in, because that's some like life advice that will allow you to live and enjoy your life if you actually take it to heart. One thing I wanted to mention that you talked about, for any of our listeners who are like, how come that lady suggested you get a divorce? I don't understand that. I suggest you go back and listen to from early season 1, when we were a tiny baby podcast with no video, our episode with Dom Evans, who is an incredible activist. And really that episode, we talk a lot about marriage inequality and how it really still affects the disability community, and how exactly Gaelynn's experience that I'm so glad you stayed on the phone for and didn't just listen to. Like, there are a lot of people who have had to make that terrible choice of like, oh, I'm going to divorce this person I love and want to spend my life with simply so I can get my health taken care of, which is, that's simply not marriage equality if people are having to make choices like that aren't choices at all. So I just wanted to mention that for anyone who might have been like, why would she have recommended that?
And like, I will say, like, Minnesota, like life hack tip, if you can handle winter, which does suck if you have a wheelchair. So I'm not like suggesting that it's easy or whatever, but like, we have such good programming here. Like right now, I mean, it could change. That's the thing about marriage equality, is that like in Minnesota, if as long as you can work $85 a month or something, I think it is, you can keep healthcare, and it doesn't matter what you earn, like at all. Which there's no ceiling to what you can earn. You just pay a higher premium, and it's pretty unusual. Like, I've done some research on other states, and like even New York State isn't as good as that. So like, but the big problem that I have with it is it's still not really marriage equality, because say I ended up being able to not work at all, like not even $90 a month. So I mean, they do set a pretty low bar, which I think is good. You don't have to be full-time or anything. But even so, if I was unable to work, we would still have to get a divorce, because the only program where they don't count your income against you. And your asset limits are much higher, and they don't count retirement. There's some really good things about how Minnesota does it. So if you're in the market to move and you have a disability, look into Minnesota, except for don't think about, I mean, if you hate weather that is cold, then still do not come here, because you will hate it a lot. It's like, we're about to get like 10 to 25 inches tomorrow of snow.
Wow.
Which
wow. Yeah. That is great.
I would like to, like, you mentioned your state, but in New Jersey, very recently, they passed a change to the workability program.
Okay.
So if you have a job, like I do, there's no income threshold,
That's good.
and there's no asset limit.
Wow.
And your income, if you're married, does not matter as far as losing Medicaid services. So I think that's really awesome.
Yeah,
and I understand more states have that.
That's really
absolutely.
good to hear. I mean,
Yeah, that's what I was
probably
gonna
people
say.
like Dom have helped the discussion, honestly. Like, Dom's been
Absolutely.
talking about that for years. And, yeah, didn't mean to interrupt you, but I mean,
Oh, you're good.
it is changing. I think we are finally, people are starting to listen. And I'm sure it's not unrelated to the fact that people like Dom have been really speaking up about it. What were you going to say, though, Lily?
Yeah, just that, absolutely, and that people who don't live in Minnesota or New Jersey can look to those states to know what to like advocate for and what to email your senators about and what to. It's just really important, and I completely agree. Of the props to all the people who have been talking about this for a long time, Dom included, leading the way to like states that are finally making changes and working towards that. So that's really great. And again, for any listeners who are like, I don't know what you're talking about, there's a lot to learn about the laws that keep disabled people from being unable to live the lives we want to live. But moving on from that into, you mentioned the way that you play your instrument, which I've watched some interviews of you talking about this, and it always makes me think about that one thing about in my experience of the disability community, like because we live in an inaccessible world, we tend to be incredible innovators and like come up with incredible solutions and new things. So you have talked about the way that you play your instrument. Can you tell our listeners about that and like how you figured out how to play and like what that experience was like?
Yeah. So, the way you play a violin typically is you have it under your neck on your shoulder and your arm is outstretched in case you have never seen a violin. And but for me, even the tiniest violin was too long for my arm. So I went to, in 5th grade, you took a music listening test to like figure out if you could be in orchestra. And I happened to be, although I didn't know it at the time, the only student that year that got a perfect score. So the teacher was like, whoa, she should definitely play something, but I don't know how to do it. She was just a public school orchestra teacher, but luckily for me, she at least decided to try. I mean, I think that's, if I can impart any like advice to educators of any field, but especially the creative arts, because I think that that's where disabled people get the least served in some cases, is people just don't understand how creative we are. And so they like preclude us from trying. I'm reading Alice Wong's The Year of the Tiger, and she was not allowed to take, she was not allowed to take a second year theater class because there was a pantomime section. And the teacher just like couldn't understand that A, you can pantomime sitting, and or B, just skip the section. Like what, like seriously? So anyways, creative arts, I think sometimes really hinder people and unnecessarily. So she luckily just said to me very honestly, I've never tried to adapt an instrument before, but I think we should try it. It might not work, but let's try it. So I went in after school one day and I couldn't do the violin on my shoulder. It was just too long. Even like the teeniest one for like the 4-year-olds was too long for me. And then I tried the cello because that's actually what I wanted to play, was the cello. But it was even, the smallest one. It wasn't that I couldn't reach the fingers, because I could, but I couldn't operate the bow because it was too far down. Like I couldn't reach low enough because my arms are pretty short. And so I think it was either her or me. My mom thinks it was me. I don't know. I don't remember, honestly. But one of us was like, maybe you could play the violin like a cello, which makes the bow not have to reach down so far because it's a much smaller instrument. And that pretty much worked, except I still couldn't hold the bow the way that a cello player usually holds it. And I was getting pretty frustrated. And I remember her thinking out loud, well, some bass players hold their bow underhanded, like it's sitting in there, kind of like the way you, I don't know, the way you hold a pencil, I guess is the closest I can think of it. And maybe you can do that because it, like the angle, it wouldn't be coming from above, it would be coming from below. and which is the direction my hands work, but they're a little bit anchored in funny angles because of the breaks that I had before I was born, and they all healed that way. So I don't have like complete full range of motion. And so, but I could hold the bow like a bass player. And I think what's really cool about that, and has actually been proven out by studies since then, is that teachers who are helping students adapt instruments actually don't need to know very much at all about the student's disability going into it. They need to know a lot about how the instrument is played so that they can be creative, to be like, well, you could still achieve this doing this, and like really be flexible. So she thought of the bass player bow hold, and that worked. And I've been playing ever since, basically. And so there's been like 30 years now. And but I did not know, again, going into it, as I'm sure Erin can attest, like you get so used to adapting that it just is sort of your default mode in the world because you just have to. And so I didn't actually think, oh, there might be a chance we won't figure this out. I just kind of assumed at some point we would figure it out, right? Whereas I'm finding that many people with disabilities have teachers that just don't allow them to try. They just say this won't work. Sorry, you won't. You can't do orchestra. You'll have to pick a different instrument. You'll have to do choir, whatever it is. And so it's really, really important for teachers to realize that adapting does not usually, if you have a supportive environment, the idea of adapting does not usually scare the kid with a disability. It's more like, is the teacher open to going into new territory? And I'm so glad that she was. I mean, neither of us thought I would end up being a professional musician, obviously. It was just like, she did what any teacher should be doing, which is like, oh, this kid has an interest, and I'm going to walk them through this path until they decide they're done, Like, how many people play an instrument in high school and never touch it again afterwards? So you don't have to start with a disabled student thinking, oh, well, they won't be able to be a virtuoso, so I shouldn't encourage them, because most kids drop out anyways. So, like, just give them the same opportunity that you give other kids, which is just to try it, right? So I got very lucky. And so that is how it started. Her name was Sue Sommerfeld. She's still around. And I think that both of us are like, wow, good thing I was, she was open to it, because that was such a big deal for me in the long run.
That's incredible. A really great lesson for educators that, like, you don't have to be an expert in disability. You actually just need to be an expert in what you're an expert in and be willing to try.
And be willing to be creative, like some technique. I had one orchestra teacher that was a teacher, like not a private lesson teacher, but a conductor later in my school days, who is less creative. And like, luckily I had private lesson teachers behind the scenes that were still pushing me. It's just really about being creative and kind of being willing to let go of that idea that like a set technique is 100% mandatory, because realistically, especially with, well, any kind of creative art, honestly, it's there to like, you want to make something that's beautiful, that touches people. And if I can make a sound that sounds beautiful to me or to people listening, does it really matter if I like hold my bow different, or if I finger the part a little bit differently because I only use 3 fingers, I don't use 4, like things like that. I think they do have to be like an expert in their field, and then willing to just like push the, my best teachers, my private lesson teachers in high school. The reason they were so good is that anytime I could do something like a technique that is classically trained technique, anytime I could do it, they definitely like made me do it. But then if there was something that I couldn't do, or I had to do it differently, they like let it go, and they just said, okay, this is how you're going to do this. But then they still held me to standards of like how I did that, like they weren't allowing me to be like, they pushed me up to where I could be pushed. And I think that's really important personally, like as somebody who got a lot out of the education of the music education, like you shouldn't say, I don't have any expectations of you because you have a disability, so you go do whatever you want, because you're not going to learn that way. But it's like just being flexible about where you push and where you say, this isn't worth, like, it's not worth making you feel like lesser than because you can't do this one technique. Let's focus on what you can do, but you should do it well, you know? Did either of you experience that? Like a teacher that didn't hold you to any standards because they didn't see potential? Because there's, in some ways, being open and flexible is really important. But on the other hand, expecting people to like rise to the occasion isn't like the worst thing either, if it's done in a way that's like honors who you are. Does that make sense?
Totally, no. I feel like most people who don't know me have no expectations of me. And so it's like, there's this thing in my head that anytime somebody compliments like my writing, everything that I do, I think in my head, are they saying it's good because they have no expectations for me? Or is it good because it's actually good? So now I have this like issue with like my own writing, that I have that conflict that I think about. And it's very stressful. It makes it really hard to like get anything done sometimes. Because I'm like, I don't think this is that good. But everyone else says it's amazing. But is it actually? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's like the insidious nature of ableism and how intense it is that like it can take away our own joy and our own success. Because I've definitely had that moment, Erin, where like someone will be like, you did so great at that. And I'm like,
yeah.
Are you being ableist? Like, did you think that what's happening here? And sometimes it was that like, I just did really good. And then I'm negating my own thing. But I will say, I work with you every day and you are a phenomenal writer. So,
yeah. Like in music, I get that at shows where people will come up and say that was amazing. And I kind of just have to silence that part of my brain now. Like, I know that there are some people that come to a show of mine that have zero expectations or are there to be inspired or whatever it is. Like, right? Like, that is just true. Like, there are some people there. But then there are other people that are, like, real music lovers that really do get something out of it. And I guess the only standard that ultimately, at that point, once you're, like, in the world, that you can really listen to is, like, did I try my hardest? And if I did, then that is what I can do. And then how other people perceive your work. I mean, this is true of any artist. I think once your work is out in the world, man, you no longer, like, how people perceive it is completely out of your hands, like, all the time, whether or not you're disabled. And so it's like important for me when I'm like, because otherwise I think I would ruin it for myself, like enjoying performing, if I was worried too much about, are people just here for, because I know it's a mix, you know, for you too, Erin. I'm sure some people are honestly, truly, truly like, holy cow, that was an amazing essay or whatever. And then maybe some people are like the classic, like, oh, I can't believe they did this thing, even though blah, blah, blah. You know, there's a mix. And so you can't, you know, either way. It's like Buddhist of us. Like, you can't take compliments or insults too seriously, right? I know. Easier said than done.
That's important, though. And as I think it's just for artists in general, for disabled and non-disabled people alike, like that is, your work is yours until you put it out there, and then let have an opinion of your own work. Don't let other people influence that, especially if you have faced like intense ableism throughout your life, because that voice in your head can get loud. Like the more you've had people look at you and be like, oh, good for you, the more you start to think that when someone actually says, hey, good for you, they are meaning it with that infantilizing, undermining tone. So I do think it's an important practice, that like the Buddhist concept of like not taking compliments or negative things too seriously, because you gotta feel how you feel, and that's what's most important. Well, speaking of like working on new projects and things, before we move on to part 3 of our interview, I do want to ask about how's writing your book going, and can you tell our listeners about the book you're writing and how amazing it's going to be?
It is going pretty well. Like silencing the jerk voice inside of my head. I feel, you're always like, I should be way farther along than this, and like, this is terrible, and blah, 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 all the negative things that happen in your head. But overall, I'm about halfway through, I think. So I'm writing the rough draft right now. I have a secret goal of trying to have not secret anymore, because it's on a podcast, of the rough draft done by like July or August, so that I have some months to edit it.
Cool.
And so that I'd really, really like it to come out in the fall of 2025. But again, like forcing art, it's impossible to do that. So I'll just kind of keep working on it. But it's been a really good experience reflecting on life. Like I was like, what am I, like people have been asking me to write a memoir for a while. And so I was like, okay, that's a cool idea. And the more I'm doing it, I'm glad that I am, because it kind of lets you reflect on like kind of like this podcast exactly. Like, here's what happened to me, and here's how I think disability was a part of this situation, and here's what you can hopefully take away from it, because everything you know about disability is wrong, right? Like that idea, and that's not the name of my book, but the idea that I think the more I'm writing and the deeper I get into it, I realize that, wow, there is a lot of stuff that I wish people understood, and now here's a chance to write about it. I don't think I realized just how often that was going to happen when I started writing, because you kind of just think, oh, this was just, like what Erin was saying, I had a basic childhood. I'm sure you did, kind of, right? But then if you really, really delve into it, there's stuff that you probably wish people had known, or like had been able to approach differently, or like what you want for the next generation and that kind of stuff. I'm reading, as I said, Alice Wong's book, and I also just have been reading more memoirs in general, and I'm a big Doctor Who nerd. In case you didn't see, I'm wearing a TARDIS necklace, which is the time machine in Doctor Who. There's an interview with the writer of Doctor Who, Russell T Davies, and he's a gay man, and he writes a lot of gay characters into his stories, and he's like, I do this on purpose because gay people have been around forever, and we've been influencing the course of human events, but we haven't been allowed to tell our own stories for very long. And so there are still stories that haven't been told about the gay experience in public. It's just like a lightning bolt. I was like, holy cow, there's a lot of disabled stories that haven't been told yet. Like, we've only had, again, like, I know that there's a lot of room for growth in the disability justice movement and rights and culture, but really, it was the 70s when people first were able to really even have control at all of the narrative at all. Like, isn't that ridiculous? Like, that's ridiculous. So, like, there are definitely stories that still need to be told. There are definitely things that non-disabled audiences don't know. And so writing a book, at first I was kind of like, why would anyone read this book? Like, just the way that we all have our own negative voices. But the more I'm like, no, I want people to read this book, and I want people to read other disabled people's books, because it's just not something enough people know about. So I'm having a lot of fun. I'm in college. I just started playing music. That's where I'm at. So I'm like halfway point. And it's been a good experience to just kind of like stretch my creative wings in a different direction than music. Because writing a book is hard, and just the like getting the voice and dialogue and all this stuff that I don't usually do when I'm playing. It's really fun. So I really recommend, even if you don't plan to publish it, like especially the disability stories, especially other minority stories that just haven't been out in the world very long. Like, I think it's important for people to learn from each other, because that's how you get that compassion I'm talking about. Like, from the beginning of this podcast, like, I don't have the ability to feel compassion for something that I don't know exists. And so I just think the more stories that we can take in as a culture, the better. So that's sort of the point of the book. We shall see what happens. But Algonquin Press 2025, that's the goal. And it is on Algonquin Press, which is pretty cool, because that's a bigger agency. So I hope that it will be read by many people, and spark other people to write their own memoirs, you know?
I'm so excited. I cannot wait to have it on my shelf. I'm so excited. It sounds like a really phenomenal book. And I think that, we talk about representation of disabled people. We've talked with like actors who have been on the show talking about on-screen representation, but we haven't really talked much about book representation yet. And like truly reading like Judy Heuman's memoir, reading Alice Wong's memoir, like I have so many on the shelf that have like really been crucial in my like own self-acceptance, in looking back through my own memories and being like, whether it's like, oh, that was a moment where I faced extreme ableism and I didn't realize it, or oh, that was a moment where like someone offered me a lot of support that I didn't realize. Like it is kind of a fun practice to go back and go through those things. And I think everyone who, you know, does the work of writing those memoirs are helping the rest of us like learn and hear our own stories through other people. Like I think that's just really exciting, and I'm so excited to read your book.
Thanks. Have you guys read Ashley Shew, SHEW, Ashley Shew's book Against Techno Ableism yet?
I literally just put this on my want to read on Goodreads. Someone sent it to me and was like, "It is you." That's the friend that recommended it to me has phenomenal taste in books, so I want to read that for sure.
Yeah, you should. I mean, honestly,
okay, cool.
It's a book that I'm going to recommend a lot of non-disabled people read too. It's stuff just putting into context like the history of disability, the presence of disability in the future, and realizing that a lot of the current problems we face are not like benign mistakes. They're like built in. And I mean, it's stuff that you'll kind of probably have heard of, but the way she ties it all together is really powerful. I really liked it. I was like, wow, everybody should read this book. It should be required reading for humanity. Personal opinion.
You know, I do hope that the more like memoirs and disability culture books that come out, the more like educators will see like, oh, this should be in my required curriculum. Like the more there is, the more like pressure is maybe not the right word, but the more influence it has in like to end up in classrooms. So I think that's, I hope so too.
Erin, what about you? Have you written a memoir yet that I don't know about?
I just started an online memoir class.
Oh, good.
So I might.
I hope you do.
I've written things and I've published things, but like not my own memoir. I want you though.
I really hope I do.
Things to say.
Yeah, I hope you do too. I mean, even with Alice's memoir is kind of like a scrapbook almost. Like there's, you know, she has like some essays and interviews, and it's a different format than I was expecting, but it's fun. So there's more than one way to do it too. Like I think that was kind of nice to see.
I can't wait until we have all of these clips and all of your books are like bestsellers, because we have Lachi talking about the book that she's writing. We have you talking about your book, Erin, your future book, like, and then someday we're going to be like, remember when those books didn't even exist and we were already talking about them? Like everything, you know, early trendsetter on books to read.
Yep, it's true. Go back to our top 10 book list or top 20 or whatever you end up making. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on to our third part of the interview. Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong is an Easter Seals podcast.
And at Easter Seals, we're all about education, employment, the community, and really helping disabled people thrive in all aspects of their life.
Yeah, so we focus on like these main pillars, which can be a lot. And we, this season on the podcast, want to kind of talk about each of those things. And we, in this episode already, have had an incredible conversation about education. And I hope educators everywhere listen and take the advice that Gaelynn mentioned. Community is a huge part of what we talk about at Easter Seals and what we're trying to make more inclusive in general. We had spoken to you before, and we're kind of talking about the community action of like calling out inaccessibility. What does it mean to be like a good community member to you, or to help create inclusive communities?
Yeah, I think, you know, the first step is to recognize if you have a gap of knowledge, like to just, like if you're listening to this podcast, just stop and think, like, how often do I think about accessibility in the things that I plan, in the events that I host, in the groups that I form, and if the answer is not a lot or none, then just recognize that and work to do something about it. So again, educating yourself and like reading some books, Googling how to make events accessible, like literally anything is better than doing nothing. And so start there. But the biggest thing I can say is that, we live in 2024 and the ADA has been around for 34 years. And so the big shift that I want to see in society, besides this idea that disability is not negative, it is a form of diversity that can be celebrated like any other form of diversity, but it's neutral. Our contributions, our culture that we create under disability are valuable. That's important to me. But the other thing is that in 2024, any place that isn't being inclusive or accessible, I think we need to start using the word discrimination. Like, it might be discrimination of omission, but a lot of times it's more than that, like the few venues that are in Duluth, the music venues that are completely inaccessible, I wouldn't say there's a lot of perfectly accessible venues in Duluth where I live, but the ones that are blatantly inaccessible, like, they know that they're inaccessible. I've talked to them about it. They're just not doing anything about it. So they're not the victims at this point of like, oh, it's expensive. Because 34 years in, you can creatively fundraise. You can, save your tips. Like, not your tips, but you can have people say, do you want to donate $1 to the Access Fund? There's lots of creative ways in 34 years that you can be making yourself more accessible. And so at this point, I think stopping frequenting the places that are inaccessible is part of the solution at this point. I don't go to the venues that aren't accessible in Duluth anymore out of principle, because I want to support with my dollars the places that have actually done the work, because it's 34 years into this civil rights law. It's not a, I don't know. I wish that our government helped businesses pay for some of these modifications. To be honest, it's an unfunded mandate, but let's be real. I pay my taxes every year. I invest money in my business. It's still not an excuse 34 years in to not address accessibility. And then to be a good community member, generally, it's just when you do Google how to make your event more accessible, just actually doing this stuff, like having captions, having ASL whenever possible. I'm an independent artist. I literally do not even have a booking agent at this point, and I pay for captions for all my live stream shows just because it's in 2024, that is what we have to be doing. And I work with people to get ASL in as many shows as I can. I'm not saying my track record is 100, because I am literally an independent artist just doing stuff by herself. But whenever, ever possible, that is something I work in. And I just want to see non-disabled people help us by taking the mantle up with us. So if you are a musician and you're booking shows, I can't urge you enough to stop booking shows at inaccessible venues. Even if it doesn't impact you directly, the world changes when people recognize that this isn't just some Herculean task that's on the disability community. This is something that we can all be a part of the solution. So my thinking is you walk by an elevator and it's out of service. If you notice it's out of service, that's a good step, right? But then are you going to call the elevator repair company? Because that would be the real step of allyship. Not just recognizing that there's inequality, but how can you actually help make it better? You know what I mean? Is that answering your question?
Yes, absolutely. And I think
okay.
that is, where the whole beginning of this interview is saying, be open to, as disabled people, not judging all non-disabled people, right? So now we're saying okay, step up for us now too. In that we need non-disabled people to be doing that too. When you go to take the train and you realize exactly what you said, Gaelynn, that the elevator is out, like, email someone from your transportation department and let them know, like, hey, at this stop, the elevator is out. That is discrimination. Like, and I really
need to fix it. Yeah.
Yeah. And using that word discrimination, I think it, you know, there's power in language and understanding, like, we need to call it what it is. 34 years, you've done nothing. That's actually discrimination. And yeah, I think that kind of goes into another one of the main things that Easter Seals talks about is like accessibility in the workplace and creating employment for disabled people that is like not only just accessible on like basic levels, but also creates a sense of belonging and like doesn't make accessibility or accommodation feel like a burden. So you have a unique experience working in the music industry as an independent artist. Have there been times in your career where access has prevented you or allowed you to progress in ways you wanted?
Yeah, actually. So before I was an independent musician, I was a lot of part-time jobber things. And so one of the jobs that I was applying for and eventually got was I was a secretary at the Boys and Girls Club in Duluth. This was a long time ago. But apparently after I stepped out from the interview, not my boss, but my boss wanted to hire me. He was like, yes, I like her. But the guy above him was like, do you think she'll scare the kids? Which, by the way, you should not ever ask that question at any point in an interview process. So, like, wrong for many, many reasons that we probably shouldn't have to elucidate here. But, like, what happened was, lucky for me, my boss, the guy who wanted to hire me, said that is not an appropriate discussion topic, and we are not going to even talk about that here. That's not even legal. So, like, he knew that and said that, and then I got the job. But the thing is I didn't even know that happened until right as I was leaving to teach fiddle lessons. Some coworker who had been in the room during the interview told me that, which I was kind of like, oh man, I wish I didn't know that, except for I was glad I knew that because it made me realize that what happens when the disabled person is not in the room is just as important as what happens when we are in the room. Mm-hmm. And so when we're talking about accommodations, when we're talking about can this person, are they qualified for the job? Can we make accommodations that are necessary? The disabled people have to be in the room when those discussions are happening. Like, they just have to be, because otherwise things like that happen. And I had a college degree. I mean, this was an entry-level administrative position. And I really, really, it was like pretty hurtful to find out that that's kind of like the takeaway that one person had from what it felt like a really good interview. You know what I mean? It's like, well, she's scared of kids. So that's the first thing is, like, when you're hiring, including the disabled person on all discussions about their disability, I think is really important. I mean, I'm not an employment expert, but I can just say in my own life, that is a really big deal. And then listening, like, one thing that disabled people haven't had a lot of in our society over the last ever, I guess I should say, is that when we speak up, that people actually do the thing that we're suggesting, right? And so if I say, I think I could do this job, but I would need this, not like questioning, like, just try it. Like, what does it hurt? Like, let's try it out and see if it works. You know, there was another interview I went to where, again, the first thing the guy said was, now that I see you, I don't think you can do this job. And so the rest of the interview, which again is another illegal thing. These are like what not to say during a job interview. So, and so I spent the rest of my interview, instead of like in the offensive, like defending, like, here's how I could do it, and suggesting all these accommodations, which is definitely not what an interview should be like. But the thing is that he didn't hire me anyway. So, like, the sad truth is, I think I could have done that job, but I do think that I would have needed some accommodations, but I thought of those already. But I wasn't given a chance to try them. So I think just kind of listening and being like, what do you think could work? Because often we're not there because we want to fail. Like, I don't go to a job interview thinking there's no way I could do this job. I go into a job interview thinking I believe there's a way that I can do this, which is why I'm applying. And so you have to find out what is it that that person thinks they would need as support and give that to them without making them feel bad about it. You know, working remotely can't be lost. I'm on the Recording Academy Chicago chapter board, and I'm really glad that I'm there because as much as everybody wants to get back to in-person events, which I understand, I'm like, just from a disability perspective, like, we have to stay with hybrid. Like, we just have to. Like, disabled people are asking for it, which means we should be listening. And so let's keep doing it. And the cool thing is, if you have a disabled person in the room, and they can say why they believe in it, I got them really excited about it. Like, we're gonna make it a cool hybrid event now. It's not just even gonna be like, oh, you go log in. Like, they were all about it, but I had to be in the room to make that suggestion. So the other piece of advice I can give in employment is really actively look to hire disabled people. Like I know that it's maybe feels new to you or like you're not sure how it will go, but it's really, really important if we're serious about creating equality that disabled people have jobs and are in the room so that they can help shape culture, you know? And then not just have them in entry-level positions all the time. Like, I just did a thing for a church, and they were saying, how can our church be more accessible? And I said, well, you should definitely have a committee that addresses accessibility, but then even on the other committees, there need to be disabled people on those committees. You know, like, every committee should have disability represented in it. And then even beyond that, like, what does your church leadership look like? Because really, things change the higher up you get to the top, where you can help shepherd in new ways of doing things, right? And you have the authority to do that. So I think integrating people at all levels of employment too is really important. Yeah, and then in the music industry, just if you're planning a concert or a festival, just making sure that you're addressing disability as part of that, and accessibility and disability representation both are important. It's not just one or the other. If you have a disabled performer, but the event is inaccessible, you have not done your job correctly. You know what I mean? So those are all the things I can think of. I mean, employment is tough because, you know, I was much happier, which is kind of like bittersweet. I was much happier when I became self-employed. And I found out later that disabled people are much more likely to be self-employed. And probably because it does suck to have to, like, advocate for yourself all the time. And I couldn't get promoted beyond entry-level jobs pretty frequently. I would have, like, there's one entry-level job I had 4 interviews for. I was like, are they vetting me for president? Like, why is this entry? And then the next time they hired that same position, when I went to another job, they did a group interview and hired on the first interview. So, like, there was clearly discrimination there, but I couldn't prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt, so I didn't do anything about it. But it was one of those things where I know that it's hard in the workplace, so what can you do to be part of the solution? Again, you know, that's what you should ask yourself.
Absolutely. And hiring disabled people at every level. Like, there's nothing you can do to make a single disabled staff member feel inclusive and belonging, because they're without even meaning to tokenize, you're tokenizing. And, like, yeah, I think that's just really important at all levels.
Yeah, like, oh my gosh, I went to UMD, the University of Minnesota Duluth, which is actually pretty radically accessible. Like, even before the ADA, all the buildings were connected, and they really tried to bring in disabled students. And but first I went to Macalester College. I transferred, and I was the only student in a wheelchair at Macalester. There was one guy with vision loss and me, and their disability coordinator was actually just the vice dean or whatever, and it was just on paper. It was not real. Like, the disability program was essentially non-existent. So when I went to UMD, there's one day where I'm in the hallway and I see 3 other people in electric wheelchairs, and I started to cry because I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize how alone I felt. You know, like, I had repressed it or, like, dealt with it, that I didn't even know it was something I wanted. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is And so that's what, yeah, at the workplace, of course, we can survive, we can even thrive in a workplace where we're the only disabled person, but it's such a relief to not be the only disabled person, you know, like, it's such a big deal. And so I look at Rant, you know, our membership, if you go through and read the profiles of the members, there are so many of us that have done really cool things. And so for people who are maybe listening to this podcast and thinking, well, sure, all levels of employment, but like, what if I can't find any qualified? I really believe that there are qualified disabled people out there. Like, I just know because I'm reading the Rant profiles and I'm like, holy cow, like, all of us have done amazing things without support from society a lot of times. Or if it's support, it's like one person that believes, not structural support. You know what I mean? And so if we've been able to do all that, like, think what you could do in a company that really supported disabled people. Like, there are leaders in our community that are ready for that kind of work. So I just really urge you to question yourself. Are you coming from a place of like, disability is scary, it's negative, and is that what's like, you know, changing your perception of this whole employment concept? Because if it is, like, just try it. Just try it. It's a good idea.
I think it also goes back to the discussion about expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Because people like don't expect us to be able to hold any job. So there's that discrimination when applying to jobs that I've encountered.
Yeah.
But yeah. But Gaelynn, thank you so much for being on this podcast. I just love having you on. I'm so lucky to have met you. I've been following you on social media for a long time. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was really fun. And what a great, I mean, just so great to be able to talk to some other radical disability advocates in the community. And just thank you for making this podcast. It's really nice to meet you both.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, it's that feeling of just being in community with other people who get it. It's so wonderful. It really is, you know, for purely selfish reasons, the reason we wanted to make this podcast, like, just so wonderful. And yeah, truly, we've been giddy excited for today. And if you haven't heard Gaelynn's music, listeners, check it out. It is incredible. And just thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, thank you for listening. Season 3, we're here first. This is it. And if you've been here since season 1, we're really happy. Thanks for sticking around. And if you're brand new, go back and listen. There's some great episodes. Tune in next time for another episode of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong.
If you liked what you heard, go ahead and subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you to our listeners. And as always, thank you to Easter Seals for giving us the space and resources to share such authentic conversations from within the disability community to our listeners.
And we'll see you next time for another episode of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong.
Everything you know about disability is wrong.
This is a podcast brought to you by Easter Seals.
You know, we actually work for Easter Seals, but maybe our listeners don't know what we do.
That's true. Easter Seals is leading the way to full access, equity, and inclusion for disabled people and their families.
And did you know we've been doing this for more than a century?
This includes helping disabled people find meaningful employment and addressing healthcare needs for all ages.
We're proud to serve communities across the country and ready for the next 100 years. For more, check out easterseals.com.